It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to welcome Professor Stuart Smith.
Well, thank you very much, Rita, for that kind introduction, and also for the invitation to come here and speak to you all. I have to add one point on my Hollywood resume, though. Before I did the Mummy movies, I did the movie Stargate. And the language, by the way, in that film turned out beautiful. It turned out well in the Mummy movies, too, but just gorgeous in Stargate, because I was actually on the set of the film for most of the shoot, coaching the actors, so it was wonderful. And I am actually in that film. But you have to look really closely, because there's a lecture scene at the beginning. You have to look over to the left, get the letterbox version, or you're not going to see me. Okay. Okay, so enough of that. And let's see. I think actually we are starting off. Here we go. That should have been the first slide. So taking their cue from Egyptian ideology, Egyptologists have often depicted Nubia as inferior, dominated both militarily and culturally by Egypt. This symbolic and material input of the Egyptian New Kingdom seems to unambiguously reflect this heavy-handed approach of domination, again, both cultural and military. And here you see a group of Nubians, the sons of the princes, who are looking very Egyptian here. Although if you look more closely, you can start seeing some subtleties, like the ivory bracelets they're wearing, for example, and this rather odd cow-pulled chariot that has no other parallel, but seems somehow Nubian in a way, and you'll see why the cow theme will crop up again. And imagery like this from the tomb of Tutankhamun. And so we see that, and this went along with the idea that Nubian culture disappeared and was replaced by Egyptian culture. But yet, at the same time, we see Nubian practices continuing after the conquest, and we can see they never fully disappeared. Similarly, during the Third Intermediate period in Nubia, as the Nubian dynasty was beginning to emerge, it's often seen as a kind of dark age, a return to barbarism after the civilization that Egypt brought during the New Kingdom conquest. But yet, again, we're finding at Tombos and other sites more and more evidence for continuities, more and more evidence for Nubians taking charge of their own development. And so we could see it perhaps more as a successor state than falling apart into these, a group of chiefdoms, for example, which is a model that people have other used. So to understand this complicated transition from empire through this intermediate period, this so-called Dark Age that we're now shedding light on, and into the rise of the Nubian pharaohs, I'll use Tombos, our excavations of Tombos, which bracket this entire period, as an example. And understanding this transition requires a more nuanced investigation, looking in particular at theories about cultural entanglement and replacing older ideas of Egyptianization, like those promulgated by George Andrew Reisner, who actually is very familiar at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts here. He was responsible for significant parts of the Egyptian collections, but also is a pioneering figure in Nubian archaeology, having excavated at a number of key sites, including the royal cemeteries of the Nubian dynasty and the Napatan kingdom and Meroitic kingdom that followed. And as an archaeologist, he was brilliant. He used techniques, very detailed methods of recording. He actually quantified things, which at the point of time when he was excavating in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was something nobody did. So technically, he was excellent. His interpretations, however, were flawed and the product of the times, really. And his kind of racist, and it fed into colonial narratives of the superior north and the inferior south. So everything good came from Egypt. Nubia did not develop anything on its own. When Nubia rose to power, it was because of Egyptian influence. So he saw the kind of natural assimilation of Nubians to an Egyptian norm. He felt even that in some cases, Egyptian colonists brought in and created civilizations like the Kerma civilization, which we now know is a native culture, and so on. Now, the notion that Egyptian material culture and the emulation of Egyptian practices by Nubians represents this kind of natural acculturation or assimilation towards an inherently more sophisticated and therefore an appealing Egyptian culture is heavily embedded still within Egyptology since the days of archaeologists like Reisner. And Barry Kemp articulated a common view of Egyptianization. I'll quote here, Egyptian culture must have had a considerable glamour in the eyes of Nubians. It is not hard to understand how, in an age innocent of the esoteric delights of folk culture, many of the local products, such as the decorated handmade pottery, which by the way is some of the most astonishingly beautiful pottery ever made, and mother-of-pearl trinkets did not survive the flood of cheap, mass-produced Egyptian wares. He concludes that, and I quote, some recognition at least should be given to the positive side of this early attempt to extend what, to the Egyptians themselves, was a civilized way of life. Now, these kind of models, which also appear with the idea of Romanization and Hellenization, have been increasingly rejected by scholars. And in fact, Michael Dietler from the University of Chicago has argued quite persuasively that this notion of a civilizing impulse is really more a construct of modern imperialism and colonialism to justify Western expansion, and especially the kind of paternalistic policies that were the case, for example, in both Egypt and Sudan under British colonial rule. That this is more a modern fiction, sort of appealing to an imagined past, and that the realities were a lot more complex. And so what I suggest here is to replace that idea of Egyptianization with the idea of entanglement. And this allows us to focus not only on imperial policy and the acts of kings, but also on the everyday choices that individuals make. So the idea is that we can trace the impacts of everyday decisions on larger scale, these kind of larger scale patterns like the rise of the Kushite kings or the quote-unquote Egyptianization of Nubians during the New Kingdom. So we can see colonial interactions not as simply a passive acceptance of a dominant culture, but rather an active process of intercultural consumption involving the appropriation and adaptation of different things, like we can see with the sons and daughter of the Nubian princes here, who are looking very Egyptian in this case, but also either indifference to or rejection of Egyptian things, and of course the continuation of older things. So we see the ivory bracelets, for example, would be something that's much more Nubian, and the individuals behind them are really showing, they're wearing a kind of Nubian outfit, I mean, sort of Egyptian outfit in terms of their linen clothing, but they're wearing a Nubian sash, a headdress with feathers, and so on. And then also there's innovation in the form of adaptation in terms of this rather unusual chariot. Just to give you an example here, but we can see this playing out on the ground at sites like Tombos. So what I'd like to do now is just give you a very brief historical overview of these periods, then move on to introduce you to the site of Tombos, and give you a quick overview of sort of the development of the site from the New Kingdom through the 25th dynasty, and then a few closing remarks about the implications of this, especially for the rise of the Nubian dynasty. Okay, so the period we're interested in here begins with the New Kingdom conquest in about 1502 BC by Thutmose I, and we know that because he placed a huge stela at Tombos right on the pathway that you would have to sail up on the river, and a whole bunch of little smaller inscriptions because he didn't want anybody to forget the idea that he was the guy who came in and he conquered Kush. So Kush was a kingdom based at Kerma, and he's really marking Tombos as a kind of frontier. And it's interesting that Tombos, so far at least, is the farthest southern Egyptian colony that's been well established. There may have been garrisons, there may have been some small groups of Egyptians farther south and through the Great Bend, but so far none of that showed up, and it seems likely that the more intensive Egyptian presence ended at Tombos. So that makes it a kind of an interesting place to look at. However, initially, we don't have any evidence for occupation at Tombos, but around 1450 BC, around the reigns of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, right at the point of time when the king of Kush was finally eliminated and a more heavy-handed Egyptian bureaucracy was installed, we see the construction of Tombos, and we see a lot of evidence for activity at other Egyptian colonial sites, a kind of ramping up of an Egyptian presence, and more investment in colonial infrastructure to the south as well. And of course, we can see this in grand monuments continuing through the New Kingdom, like the great monument of Abu Simbel built by Ramses II. So the empire lasted for a period of around 500 years until the reign of Ramses IX. And again, Egyptologists somehow have a rather Egyptocentric and odd interpretation of things. This is often referred to as the colony being withdrawn But in fact, we know historically that it was the last viceroy of Kush, whose name was Panhesi, who actually revolted against the Egyptian king, having put down a rebellion or unsettled period of time in Thebes. He decided apparently that he could do a better job than the Egyptian king and marched on Pi-Ramessa, the capital in the Nile Delta. He was defeated in Egypt by Herihor, who was sent by Ramses IX to counter this Nubian move, retreated back into Nubia, but Nubia was never reconquered. So in fact, what happened was the colony split away. There was no question of withdrawal. And it's kind of odd to think about it anyway, because we know from Tombos and other sites that these individuals were embedded in the local landscape and the local communities. So they were intermarrying with local people. In many cases, they've been there for 500 years. At other sites, perhaps even stretching back to the Middle Kingdom colonization a few hundred years earlier. So these people had been generation after generation living in Nubia. They had nothing to return to in Egypt, so why would they? So instead, the question is, did Nubia break apart, or was there a successor state? And I'm increasingly thinking the latter, that there was a successor state. Nubia didn't break into a group of quote-unquote chiefdoms. It's interesting, the use of the term, which is rather loaded, actually. And again, makes Nubia seem somehow more chaotic. It kind of buys into that Egyptian ideology of the chaotic enemy, that Nubia breaks apart. In fact, there's increasing evidence that all of these sites have continuity, and that, in fact, with a few points with inscriptions, like the famous inscription of Queen Katamala, which probably dates to around 900 BCE, we see strong evidence of a successor state, kind of Egyptianized, but different. So for example, with Katamala, showing her as an individual being the primary person in a scene worshiping a god would be very un-Egyptian. But otherwise, you can see the layout of the scene is fairly conventional. The inscription itself is hieroglyphics, kind of weird, but hieroglyphs in the third intermediate period are kind of weird anyway. So just you can imagine a kind of odd form, but nevertheless a good indication. In any case, we see by 747 BC, Nubia has control over all of Egypt, and with the final campaigns of a king named Pianki, who formerly was known as Pa, but we're back to Pianki again. There was a little linguistic dust up there, but we settle on Pianki. So there you go. Yeah, it's an obscure field sometimes. And so Pianki actually not only controlled Egypt, but battled against the Assyrians for control of the southern Levant, so Israel-Palestine today. And although often people see the Nubians as ultimately failing against the Assyrians, they actually lasted for about 100 years battling against them, which, given the fact that the Assyrians pretty much conquered everybody, is actually quite an achievement. And the Nubian armies initially had a lot of success against the Assyrians. Of course, the problem is we have the Assyrian accounts of this and not the Nubian ones. And of course, the Assyrians say, oh yeah, we won. And then we went away for 20 years because, we just didn't care. Yeah, right. Pull another one. Clearly, they saw the Nubians as a credible threat, and so pulled away because they felt they were overextended. Unfortunately, eventually they did conquer Egypt, defeating Taharqa, who you can see here, although Nubian civilization continued for another 1,000 years, which is really an incredible achievement. Okay, now specifically, let's go to Tombos. So Tombos was founded, as I said, about 1450 BC, at a key strategic point, not only in terms of this symbolic inscription and set of inscriptions of Thutmose I, about 10 kilometers north of Kerma, so very close to the capital of the polity that was defeated, but also at the headwaters of the Third Cataract. So this is a geopolitical choke point. So traffic would have had to come along the Nile, you can see here, head through the rapids, which during the flood would have been traversable, but a little dangerous. Breasted has some wonderful descriptions of this in his early 19th century journey where he was going by sailboat. A plucky guy, you'd think he was like an armchair Egyptologist translating texts, but he was out there, at a time in Sudan. I can't imagine traveling in, the late 19th century, early 20th century in that region. But you can see there's a kind of calm pond there. And just this last field season, we were able to establish the existence of a large fortification consisting of a ditch. You can see it here, lined by a mud brick wall with a stone foundation that runs at least 200 meters before it probably is eroded a bit away by the bank of the Nile receding. and then another over 230 meters, and we're still trying to trace it to its final end. So an area of around 4 hectares, actually more than 4 hectares, which makes it larger even than significant Egyptian colonies like Sai Island, for example, which was one of the major Egyptian centers. So this really is sort of transforming our idea, and I need to figure out a way of getting under these palm groves and the cultivation here to figure out what's going on. Sadly, the part of the site that's underneath the modern village is just incredibly damaged by the modern activity and some probably erosion as well. But we have found these very interesting traces. In any case, it establishes the presence of a major colony, and that's confirmed by a very large cemetery, which has been the main focus of our work at Tombos. So I'll talk primarily pretty much all about the cemetery moving forward. So the oldest part of the cemetery is in this area, and you can see here a series of pyramid tombs. Pyramids were adopted by Egyptian officials about the same time kings stopped being buried under pyramids. We see that kind of elite emulation of royalty quite a lot. But interestingly enough, next to it, there's a pyramid of cemetery rather of tumuli, and these are a native Nubian style of burial monument. And these began towards the end of the empire, around 1200 BC, during what we call the Ramesside period, because almost all the kings were named Ramses. You may remember Ramses the 11th. Yeah, there were 11 of them. But it goes into the Third Intermediate Period, or Napatan period, right up through the 25th dynasty. The thing is, though, both areas continue to be used. So you have a kind of sort of multiple assertions of identity. So you could be buried in a more Nubian tradition, and this would be obvious. I mean, it's marking on the landscape a commemoration of a deep Nubian past. Or you could affiliate more with the Egyptian side of things, and with your pyramid, or building new tombs, or reusing old tombs in the more Egyptian-affiliated side of the cemetery. So we really see a kind of multicultural dynamic emerging at this site. So just to talk a little bit about the earlier part of the cemetery first, and then I'll move chronologically through the 25th dynasty, looking at both areas. So the pyramids are really quite impressive. They're very large. The largest one dedicated to a man named Siamun, whose title I recently was able to correct to scribe reckoner of the gold of Kush, which means he probably had a lot to do with the assembly of tribute coming to the north, which makes a lot of sense given a large settlement there, perhaps a big area. Part of the reason it's so large is to enclose an area for the assembly and protection of gold, cattle even, ebony, ivory, all the exotic products that Egypt desired from Nubia, and that were part of the annual presentation ceremony. And that slide of the Nubian, the sons of the princes and so on, that was from that, an image of that tribute ceremony. But also to his mother, the mistress of the house wherein. And so you gotta love a boy who takes care of his mom. I mean, such a nice guy. But that in itself is interesting because it means that he's probably the second generation, right? If his mother is buried there, unless he dragged his mother to Nubia, which would seem rather rude, then from Egypt. But maybe, I don't know, maybe she wanted to come along to make sure he was okay, you know. But it's interesting that it's his mother, not his wife. It's kind of cool. But the other remarkable thing about this is funerary cones. So this is kind of an obscure Egyptological thing, but there are something like 400 and some tombs, New Kingdom tombs in Thebes that have cones. There are only a handful of tombs outside of Thebes in Egypt that have cones. And there are only 2 sites in Nubia that have cones. Aniba, which has 1 tomb with cones, which was the colonial capital in lower Nubia, so sadly today underwater, and Tombos. And in Tombos now we're up to 3 tombs with cones. We just found a set of cones this year to a completely different individual, a Hemnecher priest whose name I'm still trying to read, and I'll come back to that in just a sec. So there's a very strong Theban connection here, but also an element of showmanship, right? Because monuments signal identity. And so you're signaling a very strong Egyptian identity, you're signaling a very strong high status identity, but you're also signaling a strong connection with Thebes, which makes a lot of sense. Thebes was the southern capital of Egypt. We know that the vice-regency actually was originally centered at Thebes, although eventually the viceroy moved to be located in Nubia. And maybe many of the colonists came in from Thebes. And we have actual evidence that by looking at kind of biological affinities and strontium isotope analysis, that in fact we do have the first generation we have about 40 to 50% of the individuals came from Egypt. And then that drops off, although there's a steady stream of people coming from Egypt. Most of the people look local. And we have strong evidence of Nubians intermarrying with the local community. And I'll return to that theme again later. But we have the sort of biological support for that as well. Now, these tombs were decorated with all the whistles and bells that you might expect of an Egyptian elite tomb. Very little decoration has survived. We were very lucky to find this little fragment of a scene of priests, perhaps carrying a portable shrine. And you have to look carefully because, of course, it's in a fragile condition. But if you look at the back, for example, this individual's head, the arc of that is just, it's very confidently made. It's beautifully produced. And so it's really very high quality art to the point where there must have been a community of artisans living here in order to meet the demand of the elite for these high status grave goods. Some things may have been imported from Egypt. Obviously, you can't import a tomb from Egypt. We also found all the trappings of Egyptian style burials, including coffins. This fragment of 2 coffins actually showed up just this season and was super exciting because normally our coffins are completely consumed by termites, and we're lucky if we get little patches of decoration. But this one, the piece on the right is actually about this long by this high. It's almost the entire side of a coffin, and that's a kind of the shoulder piece. So it's cool, we can get names. So we have Horemheb and his wife Becky, and ebony inlaid eyes, super fine quality, beautifully carved, nicely painted. So these definitely were, the community at Tombos was definitely very well off, and this is also reflected in the bones. The community is very healthy, and there's a very low incidence, almost none, of interpersonal violence. So they seem to have been healthy and happy. What are you gonna make of that? Of course, it's a special community, it's a very privileged one, so perhaps we shouldn't be surprised, but it is one where Nubians and Egyptians are mixing. So it's an intriguing phenomenon. Now, this is what a normal coffin looks like, but you can see burial practices overwhelmingly Egyptian in the early phases of the site during the New Kingdom colonization. So you can see a group of skeletons extended, head to the west, facing towards the east and the rising sun to benefit from the rejuvenating rays as the sun is reborn in the morning after battling evil all through the night. Very Egyptian theologically. Also, you can see stacked individuals with remains of coffins there. This coffin actually had 3 people in it, 2 women on top of one, well, very lucky guy, I don't know. Okay, maybe his mother and his sister, I don't know, but anyway. But you know, that kind of thing you'd think, oh, that's weird, but in fact, it's attested in Egypt. It kind of makes sense. You're tapping into the magical power of an ancestor. And this one I was super excited because there was actually an inscription left on it. You can see one of the 4 sons of Horus there, Duamutef, represented. So I immediately started, as one does, reading it off in ancient Egyptian. Imachi Kher Duamutef, blessed before Duamutef. And fortunately, my colleague, now a full professor at Purdue University, but then a graduate student, rushed up to me and said, Stuart, no, don't, because of course you know what happens when you start reading hieroglyphs off in front of mummies. I mean, they jump up and they chase after you. And you know, if anyone should know that, it should be me, right? So disaster was averted, you know, no living dead running around, which is, trust me, just a bummer. You don't want it. So we dodged a bullet there. We also have evidence, you know, normal mummification really didn't involve all the elaborate removing the internal organs part. Normally people were just dried and wrapped. But we do have canopic jars. We just found this canopic jar this season. Again, something we hadn't found before. We found some stoppers. This is a nice clay one. There's a nice example I noticed in the galleries of a clay one. This one's a little more informal, but it has a nice inscription on it to a lector priest named Happy. I like this one too because it invokes the protection of one of the 4 sons of Horus whose name is Happy. So it's a very happy canopic jar. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. And we see other features like Egyptian amulets, scarabs, of course, being the most common amulet both during life and in death. The one on the upper right has the throne name of Ramses II on it. A nice silver mounted scarab there, although the silver is probably all gone. As you can see, it's badly corroded, but again, reflecting the wealth and prosperity of the community. They're also, again, rare because they're high-end kind of grave goods, but we found several Ushabti figurines. This one is just gorgeous. This one may have been imported because it seems to have been originally a kind of Ushabti blank. It's made out of a soft stone, a silt stone, and but beautifully carved. But the inscription was carved later, and there's a kind of broad collar on there, and kind of crudely. So I don't know if Uncle Jehuti, you know, went in and carved it out for whoever it was. They got the scribe in the family to do it. But it is a scribe and a priest whose name was T. And we found other Ushabtis. And of course, just to remind you, Ushabtis were for doing, this is from the tomb of Senenjem at Thebes. That's what the afterlife looked like to the Egyptians. So it was a sort of bucolic paradise. You got to hang out with the gods, which is cool. You got to do work, which is not so cool. And that's what Ushabtis are for, right? So it's you get your Ushabti, you recite the magical spell, and it jumps up and says, here I am, and does the work for you. So I would buy one, for sure. Yeah, that's all I'm saying. And the Egyptians, and we see all of these different features. The Egyptians kept thinking, they were incredibly creative. What problem could you run into and how can we solve it? So as you may know, the final judgment, your heart is weighed in the balance against truth. And so they came up with these heart scarabs. This one is fun. It has the more unusual human head instead of a beetle head. And the heart scarab had a special spell on it that basically, I paraphrase, says, don't rat me out. Sort of it compels your heart not to say all the bad things that you did. And kind of appealing to its better nature too, saying, we're in this together, guy. And so that would keep you from going into a fiery, nasty, hellish place. So again, we find strong evidence for Egyptian burial practices, both from the elite and kind of down the scale with coffins and things. A whole bunch of pottery. I'll just give you one example because it's cool, but it also reflects the prosperity of the community. This Mycenaean flask, probably originally holding perfume. And of course, this is, archaeologists love to say this is the farthest south that Mycenaean pottery has ever been found. So there. And when this thing came out, my jaw dropped because I was not expecting this beautiful Mycenaean pot. But it's absolutely gorgeous, of course. And it actually was imported in such large quantities to Egypt that it's actually referred to as the Amarna style pilgrim flask because of this. But it came from mainland Greece all this way. So what it means is that Tombos was tapped into this larger regional political economy as well as kind of the Egyptian culture of the core. Now, so far, everything's very Egyptian, but in fact, one of the most interesting things we found, as Rita has alluded to, is the presence of Nubian-style burials within the Egyptian cemetery. So these individuals were found in Egyptian tombs right next to individuals who were coffined and so on, but in this flexed Nubian-style position. And this does pop up at other sites, like Soleb, for example. Here's a very similar burial position with the hands like this. Reisner actually found this same burial position at Kerma in his excavations. But again, you have to kind of throw out most of his interpretations because he saw this as, these are amongst the sacrificial burials, and he saw this as people who got themselves into the flexed position and were cradling their head to keep the dirt as people were throwing it into. I mean, it reinforces this idea of Nubia as a barbaric place, right? And it plays on all of these tropes that fuel these kind of both racist and colonialist ideas. But in fact, the fact that we found it here, this woman clearly was not sacrificed, was not buried alive in the tomb. And so really it's just and it never made much sense if you really think about it. I mean, they were probably, they did practice human sacrifice. They were probably poisoned and then placed in the appropriate position. And who knows internally what they thought. Certainly it would have been an honor on one level, maybe an honor you'd rather not have, but still. The interesting thing though is these Nubian women also have little amulets with them. Oh, and the main thing is that all of these burials, and we're up to about 10 of them now, so not a lot, but they're all women, 100%. So there's a gender dynamic going on, I think, of Nubian women entering into the colony and marrying the Egyptians, but retaining their sense of Nubianness. But this idea of entanglement, so a fundamental part of entanglement is the idea that it's not just one culture imprinting on the other, but it's an interweaving of cultural features. So here you see a woman insisting on being buried Nubian style, but wearing Egyptian amulets. An even better example, I guess you'd call this a relaxed style of burial, I don't know. But in fact, I joke, but in fact she was originally like this, and some tomb robber, shortly after the burial, because all the bones are articulated, pushed her arm up and grabbed a piece of jewelry from around her neck, probably a very valuable one of gold, which tells me that these women weren't just slaves or servants, but they actually had some position in society. And around her neck, though, when we lifted the skull, we found the rest of the necklace. That's how I know there was a necklace there. And these cute little Bes amulets. So Bes is this little dwarf god who scares away evil spirits and demons and things that go bump in the night. And so the little one on the right, you can see the head's broken off. That had broken in antiquity, and it was actually strung through the arms. So she loved that little dancing tambourine Bes figure so much that even though it broke, she was still wearing it. And these kind of attachments, these kind of how the material world influences the daily life of people, and how these, this woman, again, insisting on a Nubian burial. And burials were very public events, both in Nubia and in Egypt. And this would have really been a strong assertion of Nubian identity against the very Egyptian character of the colony. And yet at the same time, she just couldn't resist this little guy Bess, because he's just too cool. And who wouldn't? I mean, you want a little scary guy like that to frighten away snakes and things. And as we'll see, Bess becomes a huge thing throughout the history of Nubia. We also find a minority of pottery, but we do find Nubian-style pottery, so the blacktop tradition does not go away. It continues right through the 25th dynasty and beyond. And in Simon's courtyard, the pot on the left was used as a cooking pot. And this is a theme that runs throughout all of these settlements. Cooking pottery is dominated by Nubian-style handmade cookpots. And that again suggests intermarriage. It suggests an interpenetration of Nubian foodways into this Egyptian context. And we're looking at trying to do residue analysis on these to get a sense of how they contrast with the Egyptian-style cookpots, because the Egyptians made cookpots that were quite suitable, but they clearly chose the Nubian ones. So maybe there's a cuisine that goes along with that. But in any case, it reflects these kind of deeper entanglements going both directions, not just from Egyptian to Nubian, but vice versa. And we can see this most clearly amongst the tumuli. So the burial monument obviously is a Nubian tradition, but as you go down the burial shaft, you see, again, Nubian tradition, the two pits on either side of the body for the legs of a bed, and we found lots of evidence for beds, but the body is supine on the back, extended, head to the west, facing east towards the rising sun. Also, sometimes they're not only on a bed, but mummified, like this individual here, and sometimes on a bed in a coffin. And pretty much every combination around that, but all but one burial, interestingly enough, of a woman, are in supine position. So this typically traditional Egyptian-style burial tradition. Most of them show some evidence of wrapping. And then coffins, beds, there's a lot of variability there. But we also get the same kind of entanglement with the Egyptian amulets. So this burial produced an extraordinary array of amulets. And you can see them here, beautiful amulets of the goddess Isis. Bes, again, another dwarf god that became popular during this third intermediate period, named Patekos. The Patekos on the right is especially impressive. And you can see it here, super elaborate. I mean, this is absolute finest quality, the sort of thing you might expect from the royal cemeteries that, in fact, Reisner excavated, and a number of examples in the museum here. Even with these little magical animals on the base of it. Really quite an astonishing little work of art. And beautiful, if you've ever worked with faience before, it's really hard stuff to mold properly, and you've got to admire someone who made this. So we get these little things that imitate Egyptian forms. This one is a little unusual, so maybe it's a local adaptation to some extent, but it's very conventional overall. But the scarab is completely unparalleled. So the scarab itself is rather large. It's about this big. Normally a scarab is more like this. And it has this absolutely unique scene of offering bearers on it. So this represents not just an imitation, but an adaptation of an Egyptian form, and then a reconfiguration of it. So they're innovating, kind of moving forward from these Egyptian elements, but kind of making them their own at this point. And at the same time, they aren't abandoning Nubian traditions. So you see all this Nubian jewelry. So ivory bracelets, quartz glaze, blue glaze quartz, which is something that goes all the way back to Kerma, and beads from the Red Sea. Also, we see reuse at the same time. We have this cemetery of tumuli. We see new tombs and reuse of old tombs in the more Egyptian part of the cemetery. This tomb probably originally from the Ramesside period, based on this cute little duck censer. One of my favorite pots that we found. It's so cute. But anyway, but about halfway down the shaft was this burial of a horse, which again just floored me when we found it. This practice of horse burial occurs at a few sites. They're fairly rare. But then at the Royal Cemetery at Kuru, they're burying whole horse teams. And so you can see this perhaps as a foreshadowing of that later practice, a real entanglement between the Hyksos, Syro-Palestinians who ruled the northern part of Egypt for a period of time, who brought horses and the practice of horse burial with them, kind of jumping over Egypt. There's only one horse burial I know of in Egypt, but several in Nubia, and then taken over in a big way in Nubia. They were into animal burials, so it makes a lot of sense in a way. This tomb burial also had a little scarab with it that looked like it showed wear, maybe part of the horse's tack. And kind of reminiscent of the tack here at the Museum of Fine Arts, excavated by Reisner from El Kuru, from these rays, these horse chariot teams. And in fact, this horse does show arthritic condition on her back that would indicate she pulled the chariot, which makes sense because horses are like the Ferrari of the ancient world at this point. You don't waste a horse on pulling a cart. A horse is a military machine. So very interesting that we find this. Also, a bit of very early iron from about 8 to 900 BC, actually 900 to 1000 BC, correction, but in line with new evidence from Merowe that iron production, in fact, is going back to this very early period. And I'm very excited to work with the archaeologists working there to try and trace some of these things. So we also have the continuing construction of pyramids, and we're hoping to pin that down a little bit more detail. But this one's definitely a 25th dynasty pyramid. I call it the Pyramid of Tui because we found this cool heart scarab thrown out by tomb robbers. So I can't say 100% sure it came from this tomb, but it makes a lot of sense. And it finds close parallels in the Royal Cemetery at El Kuru. It's very fine quality. And then next to it, though, was the most interesting tomb. This is a tomb of a soldier, a small mud brick vault that had collapsed after the tomb robbers yanked and wrenched away the top part of the body, going after, I assume, some valuable gold jewelry. The vaulting collapsed, and then the tomb robbers went, meh, who cares? We got the good stuff. And I love lazy looters. Because they go and they take the stuff. I don't want to find gold. People get too excited about gold. But I like all the other stuff. And that's exactly what they did. They took the gold and they left the rest for us. So it's really cool. And this burial really highlights this idea of entanglement, but also the kind of role that individual preferences might have played. So it dates to around the reign of Shabaka. We found this very nice little scarab showing a sphinx, or a griffin rather, trampling an Asiatic. I know it's an Asiatic because he's got a certain kind of hairstyle, very subtle, but you can see it in there. So I think of him as an Assyrian being trampled by the Nubians, so just to be a little partisan. But the tomb itself is interesting. So we have a mummified body inside a coffin, but on a bed. So you have to trust me a little bit. This is all decayed wood, but fortunately the fill around it was sand, so I could, with careful excavation, I mean, this is the part where you're picking away at things, but really interesting to see these mixed burial practices. Also in the tomb were a number of drinking cups of a new type, a kind of red polished ware, one of which had the same black top tradition that goes all the way back to Kerma, but thrown on a wheel in Egyptian technology. So they're mixing Egyptian technology with a new shape, but the old blacktop tradition, which is really tricky to do. So really impressive that they could do it. Similarly, a variety of different amulets, including a frog. Remember that for the future. Geese reflecting Amun. They were big into Amun. Patekos again. Some beads that I wonder, quartz was a very special material for Nubians, so I wonder if these beads don't reflect a kind of Nubian sensibility. The beads may actually be part of a bracelet that had this absolutely unique copper alloy scarab. I've not been able to find a direct parallel to it. As you can see, it's in 3 dimensions. It's sitting up on legs. And it has a cryptographic inscription dedicated to the god Amun, which you can translate to mean something like, Amun loves the one who loves him. So a very sophisticated bit of Egyptian theology, unparalleled though, and so I wonder if maybe even a commissioned piece, this guy went, I want something, I like that little thing, but I want it to Amun. And who knows? Or maybe it was just that he was looking for a cool bit of jewelry, and he saw Amun, and he went, I want that one. So that's how individual preference can lead some of these choices. Next to him was a stack of weapons. That's why I think he was a soldier. Harpoon on the left, which has no parallel, so I think almost certainly a local product. Again, we'll be testing that, trying to source the iron. But very early for iron, even at 700 BC, and shows that Nubians were well equipped in spite of the idea that they were easily defeated by the Assyrians, which I think we know really was not the case. And a huge spear point, it's about this big in reality, would have been a very impressive weapon, also made of iron, could be a trophy from the wars with the Assyrians. The shape of it's consistent with Assyrian ones. But again, we'll try and test that out and see if it might be a local product or a trophy of war. But interestingly enough, underneath those, a stack of arrows with microlith-tipped arrowheads that you can see here. So a very traditional form of weapon, maybe for hunting or hunting people if they weren't wearing heavy armor. A very effective weapon, but still one that goes back as far as the Neolithic. So we get a sense of multiple signaling of identities, a kind of polyphonic identity, where on the one hand, he's signaling I'm sort of Egyptian, on the other hand, local. So bed local, mummification Egyptian, Iron weapons, part of the new cosmopolitan order of the latest materials. But lithic tipped arrowheads, no, this is my traditional identity. So we also found a set of copper alloy bowls that connects him again to this larger cosmopolitan society. They may even have been made in Phoenicia in, say, modern day Lebanon and imported here, but with imagery of bulls in friezes running around with an exact parallel of the iconography of the bull from Kuru, from a bull from one of Pianki's queens that's here in the Museum of Fine Arts. And similarly, a different kind of bull, more stately bull, walking along with a lotus blossom. Very cool. And these are extremely rare, so it's interesting that 3 of them we find in his tomb. But the most extraordinary thing is this painted wooden box. Just completely unparalleled. It actually has an open work design. So you have lotus blossoms across the bottom in a solid piece, but then the papyrus swamp, you have a stalk, open, closed, open, closed, open, closed. And then you have, I'll give you a little help here. There's a cow licking a calf, and in front of there, a stork striding ahead. All Egyptian themes, but recombined in kind of a very innovative way. I've never seen anything like it. And the iconography of the cow licking the calf connected to the goddess Hathor and the creative power of swamps and fertility and all that stuff. It has a very close parallel from Nimrod, one of the famous Nimrod ivories, about this exactly the same time period and the same. So again, tying him into this cosmopolitan international culture with an Egyptian theme, but also, I think, selecting for cattle. So cattle were always big in Nubia, and it might reflect a kind of Nubian sensibility moving forward, and perhaps even a commissioned piece. Another side of it, you have to, again, use your imagination a little bit. You can see a person walking with 2 pots, water pots perhaps, and a cow or a calf through the marshes. Again, I've never seen anything quite like this. And most extraordinary, an image with a cow on one side, a calf on the other side, and a lotus blossom with a god emerging from it, Re. This is a direct reference to the creation myth, with Re emerging from a lotus from the primordial mound, or perhaps Nefertum, the manifestation of Re in that moment of the creation. So really sophisticated piece of artwork, but perhaps even made locally and sort of playing off of and innovating off of Egyptian theology. But even better, inside the box, we found this array of materials, including 3 really extraordinary faience vessels. I'll start with the simplest one. Also iron tweezers. So this guy, I mean, he's a big, powerful warrior. We know from his bones that let's face it, the guy was ripped. I mean, so he went out, he was like, I don't know, The Rock or something, I mean, he was out there, big warrior, big weapon, But man, when he stepped out, he wanted to step out nice. He wanted to be fine. He's plucking, and he not just one, but he's got to have a big set of tweezers and a small set of tweezers. I don't know what the difference between plucking that is, but whatever, he wanted it. And he has the coal hole applicators, a little needle to sew things up with, and these little cosmetic vessels, which would have held salves and perfume. So he was like glistening and smelled really good, and his hair was just right, and everything else. But this one is really extraordinary. I mean, that other one, beautiful little blue alabastron shape. This one, unparalleled. So we have a bead net pattern. You may remember from the galleries, a couple of bead net objects, one going back to the Old Kingdom in Egypt, another one from around this same time frame over mummies. But a common motif, but I've never seen a jar like this. Completely new, completely innovative. You can even see little bits of yellow at each point of the little lozenge shape that's there. And then this amazingly beautifully rendered applied decoration as if it's a pot that's being suspended and hung from the rafters or something like this. Just a gorgeous piece in beautiful condition too. But even better, this little guy. So, and it's about this big. So 4 little statuettes of the god Bes, incredibly detailed, just absolutely, I mean, these are masterworks of the faience artistry. And then the best part is the lid, though. This little lotus blossom with a little frog sitting on top. And the frog is like this big, and you can see there are little folds of skin. He's got eyes, he's got a mouth, little feet. Just astonishing, just really incredible. And again, I think this reflects, maybe, there's no reason to think that this isn't a Nubian product. Nubia had a thriving faience industry from the Kerma period. It has no parallel in Egypt. I did find one parallel from Sanam, a site near the capital at Napata, Jebel Barkal. that has the lotus blossom but without the frog. And so I really wonder if this, again, isn't, at some point, all of these different elements cease being marked strictly as Nubian or Egyptian, but are internalized. And at that point, when they fuse things together, they're making them their own, and then they can start innovating and creating new things that superficially you look at it and you go, oh yeah, that's Egyptian. But when you dig deeper, you realize, no, this is new, this is innovative. This is something important. And we see this especially with the god Bes. So, for example, we have this piece here, but the monumental statuary of Bes in the Temple of Mut at Jebel Barkal, no parallel for this in Egypt until maybe the Greco-Roman period. There's one temple I know of that has some large Bes statuary. Otherwise, Bes is primarily a household god, not worshipped in general temples, or not featured in a royal, kind of state temple setting like this. So they've taken this god Bes, they've really made him their own, and they're doing new and innovative and different things with him. And we can see this similar with monuments like pyramids. On the one hand, you could say that Nubian pyramids were inspired by Egyptian royal pyramids, but I think you can see already they look very different. And in fact, I think they're coming out of completely different traditions. Although of course, the Great Pyramids at Giza would still have been standing, nevertheless, it's these pyramids. Here's an example from Deir el-Medina reconstructed, but this is exactly the kind of pyramid that we've been finding at Tombos and existed elsewhere in Nubia. So I think they've taken on the pyramid form as their own, monumentalized it, made it in stone, transformed it a bit, but the model they're using is this New Kingdom pyramid, not the royal pyramids of the 25th dynasty. And this influence also went both ways. So we see in the New Kingdom, Amun takes on a ram form that is almost certainly influenced by Amun's syncretization or matching up or blending with a Nubian deity that was ram-based. And when you think the main Nubian deity in Egypt is Khnum, the god of Aswan, who also is a ram. So this ram imagery has an important symbolic value in Nubia. We're excavating in a Kerma cemetery to the south, and we're finding sacrificed rams as an animal burial along with our human burials. So rams have a huge symbolic importance in Nubia. And this may have even been a kind of deliberate policy by the Egyptians to make Amun more palatable, to kind of integrate Nubia a little bit more into the Egyptian world. Although conversely, it may have had the opposite effect of their intended effect. In fact, it may have helped Nubian pharaohs like Taharqa create a kind of hybrid culture that blended Egyptian and Nubian elements in a way that completely dislocated this old ideology, like from that image of Tutankhamun, of civilized Egyptian self and barbaric, chaotic Nubian other, and instead allowed them to redefine what it was to be Egyptian and redefine what it was to be a pharaoh. And again, you can look at this imagery of Taharqa, and you can see it looks Egyptian, but you look at the crown, it's the double crown, it's new. You can see the Egyptian influence there, but it's an innovation. You see the ram amulet around his neck, and a number of other practices, the prominence of queens, for example, in the royal cemetery and in kind of political life. So we can see Nubians not simply imitating, not simply assimilated, but adapting, selecting, transforming, and innovating off of a fusion of Egyptian and Nubian ideas, cultures in entanglement. So in this way, the kind of ambiguities created through the colonial experience and in its aftermath, all the individual choices that gradually accumulated and created this entangled culture could have contributed to the emergence of the Kushite dynasty as both distinctively Nubian and as legitimate successors of pharaonic kingship, in spite of their foreign origin and mixed cultural practices. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions. Yeah.
Oh, I loved your lecture.
Thank you.
But you referred to recent biological
Yes.
investigations.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us what genetics is telling us about the relationship between Nubians and Egyptians.
Yeah, the genetic side I'm not so sure about, in part because we haven't been able to get DNA. Okay. We've tried several times. There's a problem with North Africa in general. Although it's possible to get DNA, it's really hard. And so we know that there's DNA there, it's just too fragmented. Although we've been doing this over the years. We submitted samples and talked to people. And this last time, there's a bioarchaeologist at UC Santa Cruz, our sister campus, we've been working with a bit. And he was actually more encouraging this time, so we may be able to get DNA. I mean, I would love to be able to look at the DNA of these folks, see how the people because these tombs often are communal tombs. They have a bunch of people in them. How are they all interrelated? We're also excavating in a Kerma cemetery, as I mentioned, that dates before the conquest, but very close by. And so it'd be really interesting to see what relationship that older population has to the colony, especially in this context of intermarriage. So what we've been using instead as a proxy are craniofacial measurements, and these are not the old, bad, racist sort of things. So we're not looking for race, because race, of course, is a cultural construct. It's not a biological reality. We're looking at population relationships. And so by selecting certain measurements, they're the sort of things that explain why you look like your mother or father or brother or sister. And so these inherited traits. And so we can get a sense of distance. All right? And what we have are Nubians and Egyptians to start with overlap quite a bit. Egyptians in general are a more homogeneous population. Nubians in general are more heterogeneous. So there's more diversity, which makes a lot of sense because Nubia is a place where a lot of people are moving back and forth. So it's a more complex sort of biological thing, but definitely related to Egyptians. And then in terms of our folks, what we see is they start off with people who look more Egyptian, people who look more Nubian, and a few folks in the middle. And then over time, those poles go towards the middle. So the thinking is that then what we have are colonists, and we know that from using strontium isotopes, which it's a rare isotope that, depending on the geology of the place you're coming from, and our geology is very distinct because we're at a cataract with all these big granite outcrops and things, and very different from, say, Thebes. And so if you look at teeth, you can tell where people grew up. And so we've been doing that, and that shows that, again, we have Egyptian colonists, so we know people are coming from Egypt. All of the women buried in Nubian style are local, which makes sense. We can't say more than that, but again, we get the sense of intermarriage and interbreeding, to use not an elegant term, but that's what's happening, right? So you're producing mixed offspring. So you really have not only entangled cultures, but an entangled biology. And so hopefully we can move on to DNA and get a sense of that.
If we could go back in a time machine,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to ask you the $64,000. What color were the Egyptians? What color were the Nubians? What did they look like?
They look.
Egyptians look like Mubarak? Did they look like?
Now, I'd say they look more like. Actually, Sadat would not be a bad approximation.
Was Nubian.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
So I think Southern Egyptians, very close to Nubians. They have a sort of gracile facial structure, kind of more pointy nose because they're adapting to a more arid environment. I mean, things like nose shape and skin color are evolutionary adaptations, right, to climate. So nose shape, flatter nose, a more humid climate, pointier nose in a arid/colder climate where you need to warm up and sort of humidify the air as you bring it in. Skin color similarly has a clinal distribution, so the closest you get to the equator, the farther out. But I'm somewhat unorthodox amongst Egyptologists in that I very strongly feel, and maybe it's my perspective from the South, that ancient Egypt is an African civilization fundamentally different from Near Eastern civilizations. And you can really see it if you look at the institution of kingship, the symbols, and especially coming out of a deep past during the Neolithic. So we tend to look at Egypt as it is today, and when we think about the origins of Egyptian civilization. But the ecology was completely different. The Sahara was a vast grassland with pastoral nomads running out. It's the earliest domestication of cattle, and a very sophisticated culture. That was in interaction with, it was part of a larger cattle complex. And when you look at the different practices that come into Egypt, you see that's the fundamental core. And Henry Frankfurt recognized this in the 1940s, talking about an African substratum to Egyptian civilization. And more recent work, as we know more and more about this, suggests that Egypt is coming out of those traditions. And that's where you see the cattle elements in Egyptian civilization too. The king wears a bull's tail, for example. Hathor is a preeminent fertility goddess. The Waz scepter, which is actually a dried bull's penis, it's still used as a symbol in some Nilotic cattle pastoralists. Also, I think, the thing about race is that race is a modern construct, right? And you can never draw a line and say, line up everybody in the world, and you say, these are black people, these are white. You can't do it because it's all gradual. People intermarry. There are no real races because races posit a kind of subspecies of people. So instead, if you use a modern definition of race, you look at the ancient Egyptians, they look at the folks that I worked in Luxor, for example. Any one of those guys, any of the Nubians that I work with, stick them on a bus in Atlanta in 1950, where are they going to sit? They're not sitting in the front, they're sitting in the back. So I have no problem characterizing ancient Egyptians as black African people. I don't think they came from West Africa. So I don't buy into that radical diffusion, Sheikh Anta Chop. I mean, he rightly criticized the resistance to place Egypt in Africa. And so I think it's right on that score. It's just he sort of went overboard. But I think you have to see Egypt as an African civilization. And some of my colleagues tell me, well, why does it, it doesn't really matter anyway. And no. Yeah, absolutely. It defeats racism.
It mattered enough for people to try to take Egypt out of Africa.
Exactly so. That's the thing. And ultimately it defeats racism, because you can't have a civilization like Egypt or Nubia as well. I mean, Reisner went to great lengths to try and make Nubian civilization not African. And people called him out on it. Even that early Juncker, for example, criticized his characterization of Kerma as a kind of colony. But I mean, it defeats racism. You can't say an inferior people built the pyramids and created Egyptian civilization. So I think it's important to make that statement, and it's valid because, like I said, you stick any of these guys, Tutankhamun on a bus in 1950, he's not sitting in the front. And I see it as an African civilization, but people disagree about that. I think it's unfortunate, but that's my perspective.
Yeah, it's a difference between down the Nile and up the Nile, right?
Yeah, and it's Colonial, so people are and people are a lot lighter in the north, darker as you go farther south, and so on. But also there's a biological flow and a cultural flow as well.
Right, and I love any evidence that we have of the quote-unquote outside world anywhere in Africa. Dynasty pottery in Great Zimbabwe.
Right. Yeah.
Examples that you gave are great, but what about the other way? What about things from Nubia, things from Egypt that ended up in what is now Europe or the Mideast or the Arabian Peninsula?
Yeah, it's easier to see the Egyptian connection. Oh, sorry, I was supposed to be repeating questions. I forgot to do that. So the question is, you have all this stuff, we found stuff being imported into Nubia, what came out of Nubia or came out of Egypt for that matter, into the Mediterranean world. And so it's easier to trace the Egyptian things partly because we just know more about them. Also, it's closer. But the international style of both the Bronze Age and Iron Age, for example, are profoundly influenced by Egyptian art and iconography in this adaptive way, though. So it's not slavish imitation, it's adaptation and transformation. Also individual objects, amulets, scarabs, other things. But then that also started this whole industry, it's fascinating, in Syro-Palestine of knockoff scarabs. So they make these local scarabs and they put like hieroglyphs on them, but the sort of hieroglyphs you'd see like in the Khan el-Khalili in Cairo in a cheap, touristy shop, right? They're nonsense, they don't make any sense, but they look Egyptian, so they have an exotic appeal. And then it fades out as you go farther and farther. There are a handful of objects from, say, Crete, the Minoan, Mycenaean civilizations, and we have some objects as well coming the other way, and so on. Heavier influence, not surprising, closer to Egypt. In terms of the Nubian influence, it's a little harder to trace. Certainly goods, like ivory, gold especially, ivory, ebony, exotic product. Yeah, gold for sure. So I mean, anyone who has gold jewelry, probably the way gold gets remelted, there's probably a little bit of it that's Nubian gold, which is kind of a fun thing to think about.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Can you speak at all about your understanding of the relationship between the divine wives of Amun as related to Nubia, and then also one of your slides had noted the goddess Hecate, which I was surprised to see related to Nubia.
Yeah, so I think, so two questions. The relationship of the gods' wives of Amun, a very important institution, especially in the Third Intermediate Period and the 25th Dynasty. And then I suggested that the little frog might be Hecate. So I'll start with the latter one. I'm making a slight leap, but in fact, we do see frog imagery in Nubia. There are actually some beautiful little frog statues in the National Museum in Khartoum. And I think it's related to the creation myth. So Hecate is one of the 4 primordial deities. It has to do with fertility and reproduction. but I haven't had a chance to look into it. I mean, I literally just found this like, a month ago, these little fans figurines. So I'm still working through it and wrapping my mind around it. But I think possibly that that would be plausible, especially in the context of this remarkable box with all the fertility things. And cosmetic equipment generally tends to have these kind of fertility overtones in Egypt and sort of transferred into Nubia. So the Gods' Wives of Amun is an interesting institution. It began actually I believe in the New Kingdom, and it becomes more and more prominent during the Third Intermediate period. It's a powerful institution run by a woman in Thebes. So it is tempting to suggest that the Nubian co-opting that institution by having the sister of Pianki adopted by the God's wife currently ruling Shepenwepet. And so they, so it's a strong female thing, but it already kind of was a strong female institution before that. So I'm not sure that's Nubian influence, but it's certainly something that Nubians would have thought, yes, we can tap into that. Because we know that the Nubian queens had a very strong role to play. Their pyramids are every bit as big as royal pyramids. They're decorated with the same decorative program, and there's somewhat later historical evidence showing that they played a key role in things. They're also shown later on in poses that you almost never see Egyptian queens, like slaying enemies, for example. So it definitely would have suited that. I can't remember who it was that was talking about it, but someone was pointing out that maybe the strong position of this office had something to do also with Libyan influence, where women might have had a more prominent role as well. But you do see it going back. Could be a way of Thebes leveraging power as well. So creating an institution to balance against the kings in the north, because Egypt is becoming increasingly factionalized as you move towards the 25th dynasty. And that's one of the key things that Pianki does, is he goes in, defeats everybody, and unifies Egypt by bringing, getting the homage of all of these individual rulers. There were up to 3 dynasties ruling at the same time, plus this powerful institution in Thebes and other petty rulers here and there. And there's a beautiful scene of Pianki in the Delta after he's defeated everybody, and they come to pay homage to them, and they come to bow down before him, and he sends a bunch of them away because they've eaten fish. And fish eaters will not be allowed in my august royal presence, and just lets the one guy in who knew better and didn't eat fish. So that's part of that creation of a new ideal of kingship, right? He's saying, this is the right way to do things. You don't know it. I do. So it's a really dramatic moment that sort of culminates his account of the conquest of Egypt. Yeah.
Professor, is there any evidence about the language that the Nubians spoke at this time?
Yes, that's a good question. Is there any evidence for the language spoken at this time? And around 200 BC, we have the first writing of a Nubian language in the Meroitic language, which has still not been completely deciphered, but frustratingly we can pronounce because it's written in a kind of alphabetic, or really it's a syllabary based on ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. And so a number of words have been recognized from cognates and other Nubian languages and so on, the language called Meroitic. It's very closely related to modern and medieval Nubian, although it's not exactly the same. And Claude Rilly, a scholar at the Sorbonne, has been making amazing progress by using a very comparative linguistic approach. He's actually studied with, say, the Nuba, who are not Nubian, but do speak a related language in the south of Sudan before, of course, things blew up there, and looked at various other living languages, including Nubian and so on, as well as ancient traces. And we do have a number of names of enemies from the Middle Kingdom. So this would be the time of the heyday of the Kerma civilization. And looking at those names, he argues, and I'm persuaded that those are in the same language family. You can't say much more than that. But he argues that this spoken kind of Nubian language goes at least that far. Now, modern Nubian and medieval Nubian is not quite the same as Meroitic. And some people use that as an argument to say that this is a more recent movement of people into the area or something. But I don't see it. When we haven't done genetic tests or anything, but when I look at the folks that live in this village where we're excavating, and you look at them, and you look at the artistic imagery, but also you just think about the physiognomy and what might have happened if Nubians and Egyptians blended together, and they look like that. So I don't see any reason to think they're not anyone but the descendants of those people. But the fact that the language is a bit different shouldn't be surprising, because Meroitic is an official language, right? And Nubian is a colloquial language. So So it could be it's as simple as that difference, or perhaps slightly different dialects that went one way or another. But Nubian is very closely related to Meroitic, not exactly the same. I think probably it goes back deeper than that, simply because when you think about that period of the North African pluvial, when you have all this rain coming in off of the Indian Ocean, it seems likely that movement was fluid. And at some point, we know that these Nubian language, which is not part of the same language group as ancient Egyptian, came in and kind of took over in the Middle Nile region, right exactly where I've been talking about. And it seems likely that sometime during that period, so let's say somewhere in the range of 10 to 6,000 BC, you would have had a group of people moving into the Middle Nile region, and for whatever reason, the language takes off and takes over. And of course, language doesn't necessarily correlate with people, right? So a language comes in, people like it for whatever reason, or there's a good reason to learn it, and it can take over naturally. But I think it must have deep roots, and that's what Cloud really thinks as well. But the earliest evidence point is from, let's say, somewhere around 2300 BC, when we have these Nubian names in the execration texts as enemies. So at least back that far, probably farther.